Welcome to a homegrown family podcast where we grow the produce and the kids. Hey everybody, welcome to a homegrown family podcast. I'm your podcast host here, Joe Metler, and today I'm running it solo. I have a topic that may bore some, but may be intriguing for others. Bear with me, or move on to the next episode. If you haven't gathered from my episodes already, I tend to cover quite a few different topics. Anything from raising chickens, butchering chickens, to talking about my family and how they kind of grew up on their individual farms, my parents and grandparents, to mushroom hunting, foraging, to gardening type topics. And eventually here we're going to get into some child rearing, homeschooling education type stuff, kind of as that progresses in my life and becomes more actual and comes to fruition in my own life. I'll start discussing that a little bit more. So, the topic of the day is soil testing, soil sampling. Is primarily what I'm going to talk about, in addition to micronutrients and macronutrients and mobile nutrients versus immobile nutrients and some kind of nutrient basics when it comes to gardening. So, growing up on our farm in central Minnesota, for those of you who haven't listening and haven't picked up on that yet, that I was raised on a farm. My parents were raised on a farm. My grandparents were raised on ranches or / farms. My mom had a big garden. My grandma had a big garden, and so forth. And what we did every single year is that my dad would put manure onto our garden from the cows, or the pigs, or the chickens, or a combination of different manures from all the livestock that we had, all the animals we had, right? And so he'd take his tractor implement, his cultivator, and cultivating the manure into our garden. And that's what we do pretty much every single year. The manure is a great source of nutrients. I was oftentimes in the raw form, so it took a little time for the manure to break down and wasn't usually available that first year. But succeeding years after that, it became available. Good source of nitrogen, potassium, and so forth. So those listening who don't have a large garden, don't have livestock or animals, or easy manure access, this soil testing might be a little bit more for you, because we didn't do any soil testing or soil sampling in our garden back home when we were kids, because we just have manure, and that's just the way you did it. And I'm assuming that most of you who are listening probably haven't done a whole lot of soil sampling either, apart from maybe testing your soil prior to putting it in your garden in a certain location. Or you test it when you start seeing something not going right. Your tomatoes are a little bit more yellow than normal, or they didn't really bear much tomatoes this year, and so you're kind of curious about what the heck's going on. And so you do a soil test to figure out what's going on, right? There are also some visible symptoms that you can see that your plant can tell you about what nutrients it's lacking from. And so we'll get into that a little bit here soon, too. Your primary goal of soil sampling, then, is going to be to determine the fertility level of your soil, your pH, your nutrients, your nitrogen, your phosphorus, potassium, and different types of things like that. Your organic matter plays a role in how healthy your garden is. You're trying to determine why your garden isn't doing as well as it should. On that note, let's go ahead and jump into a couple of different terms or things to get into some kind of basic nutrient stuff before I talk about how I go about soil sampling. So macro and micronutrients. This is going to be different than your micro and your macronutrients for human consumption. This is going to be different than your micro and macronutrients, when you're talking about diets for people. This is a macro and micronutrient that's necessary for plants, okay? I say macronutrients, but it's really elements, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium. Those are really elements on your periodic table, right? For those of you who remember your college or high school chemistry class, that's what we're talking about when I say nutrients. We're talking about elements. Everybody talks about it as a nutrient in terms of fertilizer and things, so these macronutrients are basically the stuff that's found in larger quantities in the soil and is used by plants at a higher amount. Then there is also primary macronutrients and secondary macronutrients. So your primary macronutrients are going to be your N, P, and K, your nitrogen, your phosphorus, and your potassium, while your calcium, magnesium, sulfur are considered secondary macronutrients. All these nutrients are essential for plants. They cannot lack one entirely. Otherwise, the plants will just not function the way they're supposed to. they will, maybe not reproduce or, grow really short and just get stubby and die, But it's required for plants to be able to grow and reproduce the way they are meant to. So I just kind of want to go over briefly the different functions of each of these nutrients within the plant. And I'm no plant physiology, biology guru by any means. I did take the courses in college, but some of this is kind of dusting off the shelves in my brain here. So let's start off with the macronutrients, your nitrogen, phosphorus, and your potassium. Your N, P, and K, which is probably the primary nutrients any farmer looking to use synthetic fertilizers to supplement his land is going to be looking at, the N, P, and K. And if you're in the store and you're looking at, your Miracle-Gro, you can find like a 20-20-20. Like the numbers are indicated on the bag of what those macronutrient amounts are. Example, the Miracle-Gro at 20-20-20, it's basically 20% potassium, 20%, nitrogen, 20% phosphorus. I didn't say that in the right order, but the order is nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, NPK. And if you look at the label of those products, if there's a fourth number, it is considered sulfur. So those are what you're looking at when you're looking at the store. If you're looking at purchasing blood meal, I think it's like a 10-0-0. It contains 10% of a pound per pound of product, basically. 10% of N. That's your blood meal. And your bone meal is going to have a little more of your potassium in it. Couldn't tell you what the formulation of that product is offhand, but that's kind of the numbers that you see displayed on your fertilizer bags. Anyways, nitrogen is a fundamental role in energy metabolism and the protein synthesis within the plant. It aids quite a bit in photosynthesis activity and chlorophyll formation. So when you lack nitrogen, your deficiency symptoms are going to look like, loss of vigor in the plant and loss of color. You're going to start seeing chlorosis in the leaves. And a lot of this will occur from the bottom up. When your plant doesn't have enough nitrogen, your bottom leaves are going to start yellowing off first and slowly work its way up the plant. Your plant is going to take the nitrogen from the lower leaves and move it to the new growth where it needs it. And so that's the problem or symptomology that you'll see. Tomatoes are a plant that heavily use nitrogen, and so sometimes you might get a little bit of yellowing on the lower leaves prior to the end of the season because it's using up so much nitrogen. And it needs to move that nitrogen from the lower leaves to the upper leaves to be able to produce new growth. That's not always the case. Sometimes your tomatoes are just naturally senescing if it's a little bit later in the year. You never know. Sometimes that's why a soil test helps. Phosphorus stimulates root growth and promotes early vigor in plants, promotes flowering. It is involved in transporting and storing energy or electrons within the plant, ATP, basically your energy molecule within a plant. But that kind of gets more in depth than what most of you care to hear. So the deficiency symptoms of phosphorus is a reduced flowering amount. It can be browning of the leaves or purpling of the leaves. For example, in corn, especially corn, in a commercial level, you'll see a phosphorus deficiency present itself as a purplish color when it's requiring a lot of phosphorus when it's young. It'll oftentimes outgrow that and it'll be fine. And then potassium, your K, is heavily involved in osmosis and water regulation and transportation of different substances and nutrients through the vascular system, your phloem and your xylem tissues. Basically, it helps try not to get too scientific here, but the potassium will work through osmosis, once it goes from a lower concentration to a higher concentration. So those potassium will move back and forth to help the flow of water and other nutrients from lower to higher concentrations and so forth. It increases the photosynthetic rate of plants, and it strengthens cellular structure. It adds turgor and rigidity to plants, and it stimulates the synthesis of enzymes. And enzymes are basically a form of protein that is utilized to be able to trigger certain responses of plants. So if your plant needs to have more of this type of nutrient, your enzyme might go over there and say, hey, trigger this reaction to result in this different byproduct to be made. The deficiency symptoms of potassium could appear as wilting or shortened internodes, so just kind of a little bit shorter statured plants. It's kind of harder to tell what a potassium deficiency looks like, to be honest with you. But it's not, at least in my neck of the woods, in the Red River Valley, between Minnesota and North Dakota, you typically don't see a potassium deficiency in your natural soils. So it's not something that people really need to worry about too much around here. The other thing I wanted to say about potassium is that potassium helps support your response to unfavorable conditions. So like if you're in a drought and you lack potassium, you're going to see drought symptoms faster. And so if you see that, tomatoes on one side of your garden are nice and bushy and healthy, and the other side of the garden is kind of like a little bit more wilty, it could be a cultivar difference for one, but if it's the same cultivar but you have them kind of in two different spots, it could be just a small area that's lacking in your potassium because it's not responding as easily to some of that turgor and rigidity and movement to water. So that's the NPK. That's the primary big ones for your primary macronutrients. Moving into your secondary macronutrients, that'd be your calcium, magnesium, and your sulfur, or some of the other ones that are considered secondary macronutrients. And these ones here also are not too often lacking in amount in the soil, perhaps your sulfur, at least in the area in which I grew up, in the area of northern, upper Midwest here. Calcium is involved in cell growth and development, root formation, things like that. Sometimes you'll hear certain soil scientists talk about the calcium-magnesium ratio. You want close to 1 to 10 to be adequate for good function of the plant. There's a lot of debate there, so we'll stop at that. Calcium deficiencies will show up on the first or younger parts of the plant and younger leaf tissue, and it will turn brown and chlorotic spots that will kind of develop on the outsides of the margins of the leaves, kind of be your calcium deficiency look. Oh, and I forgot to mention that when it comes to phosphorus deficiency, that's also usually present in the younger parts of the plant. And it will show up kind of as a yellowing also in terms of phosphorus. But that'll occur at the younger leaves first, which your nitrogen's opposite that. Magnesium is very important for chlorophyll production. It's basically the enzyme activator for chlorophyll. And so it's very important for that function of the plant to exist. The deficiency of magnesium is that you can sometimes have weak stalks. You'll have loss of greenness. Although loss of greenness in the leaves, the veins of the leaves will still stay green. So that kind of is a key indicator that's a magnesium deficiency. And then sulfur aids in the formation of chlorophyll and helps metabolize nitrogen, and then plays a huge role in plant defense response to insect injury, environmental stresses, climatic stresses. And your deficiency for sulfur is going to look like more of a lighter green, pale kind of appearance of the leaves, and can look a lot like a nitrogen deficiency. And so sometimes it's hard to tell which deficiencies you have, and so that is kind of a reason to perhaps look at doing a soil test. They're not all that expensive. I know the North Dakota Soil Testing Laboratory here at NDSU, I think it's like $25 for a basic sample to test your NPK, pH, soluble salts, organic matter. And then if you wanted some more additional information in terms of sulfur, zinc, or copper, iron, that type of stuff, it'll cost you a little bit extra, like $3 to $5 per sample, on top of the basic $25. You can also go to a place called Agvice over in North Dakota. Probably be a little bit more spendy, but they might have a little bit faster turnaround times. And I'm not sure exactly. I've never used them. They probably provide some kind of recommendation for your garden, depending on what type of stuff you want to grow or what you want to produce there. Same with NDSU. So yeah, and then micronutrients. I just kind of want to mention those. I don't really want to get into those too much, but that includes like your zinc, your boron, your iron, copper, manganese, chlorides, and things like that are considered your micronutrients. It's still essential, but not very often are they in short supply within the soil. Most of that is because they are considered an immobile nutrient compared to some of the primary macronutrients, which can be mobile, which means that they move with water. I have seen in my past here, when I worked at a co-op in central Minnesota, my first summer of college, basically, I was helping out in the fertilizer room at a local co-op there, and it wasn't that uncommon to put some zinc and some boron in their fertilizer mixes. So I think there was a little bit of a boron deficiency in that region, or like at least not in the ideal conditions. And I don't think it's super available to plants, so having a little bit more in the soil that was helpful for that. But as far as I know, zinc and boron are pretty important for flowering and things like that to promote flowering and like fruit development. So I just wanted to also talk a little bit about mobile and immobile nutrients. This is basically their mobility within water in the soil. And nitrogen you always talk about problems of nitrates in soil water wells and things like that. Nitrogen is a mobile nutrient. It moves through the soil. That's probably the primary one you're ever going to have to fertilize for is going to be your nitrogen because it just moves down the soil profile. I am doing a soil test myself this fall because I know that I had a lot of nitrogen in my soil, my raised beds, due to the compost that I had in there. But I know it dries out super quickly, so I had to water a lot to keep up with everything. And so I'm wondering how much of my nitrogen's actually made it below my root zone. And so that's what I want to know. And one of the questions I have and why I'm doing a soil test. Sulfur is also another one that's considered a more mobile nutrient. And I'll probably find a website here and post a little link in the show notes just about some different mobile and immobile nutrients just so you guys can know. I'm not going to go through them all. More of your immobile nutrients are the ones that you typically don't have to fertilize for as much. It would be phosphorus, potassium, calcium, and the majority of the micronutrients, like I mentioned before. So, I guess, why soil sample? Kind of commented to that a couple times. To know what your soil is deficient in for adequate growth of your garden. You want to start off on the right foot. So if you're doing a site selection, which I think I had a podcast on episode on earlier, it was called Where Art Thou Garden, and talked a little bit about soil selection and things like that, or site selection for your garden. So go ahead and go back and listen to that one if you'd like. And so there's always room for in-season adjustments. You know, if your tomatoes are starting to look a little bit more yellowing on the bottom of the leaves, and it's only in, middle of June, you can always look to add some nitrogen on top of that after the fact. You don't have to put all your soil nutrients into the soil in the fall or in the spring. Typically, you want to fertilize in the spring, so that way you aren't washing away some of those more mobile nutrients with the snow melt up here in the upper Midwest. I personally don't mind fertilizing in the fall, just because then once the soil is ready to be worked up and ready to go, it's one less thing I have to worry about in terms of fertilizer. You can get into the field that much quicker, a couple days sooner, because I don't have to go to the store and go buy fertilizer, or I don't have to worry about spreading manure on my garden and cultivating it in first. And it saves you some time, if you're trying to stretch out the length of your garden, which is, it's kind of an important factor up in the upper Midwest here. You're only limited to so many days. I guess, for example, in terms of that in-season adjustments, I had a neighbor of ours back home they were like, hey, take a look at this corn. And it was just corn, and it was 4th of July, let's say knee-high by the 4th of July. Well, that was back when my grandparents were living. Now it's more like chest-high by 4th of July. But this stuff was still like knee-high, and he's like, yeah, it kind of looks like it's yellowing a little bit. And I'm like, well, the bottom leaves look like they're kind of wilting some, and it definitely shouldn't be naturally senescing, where it naturally loses its leaves over time. And so I'm like, gosh, if I were you guys, I'd put on some nitrogen fertilizer on that, put on some urea or something like that, or urea is probably going to be your quickest synthetic option for fertilizer to be able to get a quick response. A lot of those more organic fertilizers like your blood meal and things like that and your compost, it's not going to be available to the plants immediately, or at least not in the amounts that are going to make much of a difference in season. This is my personal opinion, but I know the blood meal takes a little while to get, plant available. So I said, yeah, put some urea on there. And then we went through the calculations of how much he should put on per space. And basically it was like 10 pounds of urea for the space of corn he had. And they sent me a picture like 2 weeks later, and he's like, man, this stuff's really going off crazy right now. So yeah, it ended up being like, good yield and everything. So that's just one example, I guess. So I guess another example on the same note of, why to soil sample is, I guess I had a friend of ours that had 2 different raised garden beds, right? And one raised garden bed he put in a couple years before the other. And so they had 2 different soil sources. The first one had pretty well-draining soil, dried out pretty quick. And so I'm assuming there's probably a lot of leaching of nutrients or whatever in there, but you never know. The other raised garden bed they put in second had a lot heavier clay soil and kind of sometimes tended to pool water during the season when they got lots of moisture or lots of rainfall. And so there's definitely 2 contrasting textures within these different garden beds. And I was like, hey, why don't you take a soil sample of both and see if you can just, remove half the soil in one, put the other soil in, mix it in, you might have a good amount of, nutrients there. So we actually did the soil test, and sure enough, that turned out that could be the situation, or the prominent solution was just being able to mix both the soil types together, because the one was still maintaining a high level of nitrogen and nutrients, where the other one was pretty low in nutrients. Combine them together, and they both had adequate amounts, but not quite enough. So after that, I knew that my raised garden bed had like 300 pounds per acre of nitrogen. My garden's not, acres large, but that's the amount. And I back calculated that out to so many pounds or volume of garden I knew we need to add from my garden bed soil to his garden bed. And basically it's like, hey, here's 3 5-gallon pails for your raised garden bed. And that'll be enough to put on, 30, 40 pounds of N to your garden bed based upon how much nitrogen that was in my soil. And so we were able to supplement his soil with that a little bit, and he was off to the races. That's pretty cool. So, I do get friends and family from time to time and say, hey, what do you think about this stuff? The same for you guys that are listening, or you gentlemen, ladies. If you have some questions about your garden, now that it's coming into winter and the gardening season's over, if you had some questions about your garden, if you had a soil test and they didn't really provide a whole lot of feedback about what to do about it, go ahead and shoot me an email at homegrownfam@gmail.com. And I'll provide some feedback on that for you guys. I might have some follow-up questions to clarify, what types of plants you're growing or this or that or whatnot. But I can definitely tell you if you're low or high in nitrogen or what types of fertilizers or how much of fertilizers I'd recommend. But yeah, I'm also not a business in that fashion, so be patient if I don't get back to you right away, but I can probably get back to you before spring. So the next thing of this episode is soil sampling. How do you go about sampling your soil? And the most important thing is to get an adequate representation of the soil in your garden. If you want to break it down into zones, you can do that. If you have a sunny zone, a shady zone, and a zone that gets more water than most because it's a little bit lower down on the slope or something, you can always zone it out into certain areas if you think that there's going to be a nutrient difference. My raised garden beds and most gardens I see are pretty flat level ground that are going to have little variability to need zones. And so depth is the first question. How deep do you want to sample? Well, how deep do your roots go for your garden vegetables? So that kind of depends. I would recommend doing a foot deep. If you do any less than that, you're going to start eliminating too many areas of your rooting zone that your crops can get into, your vegetables that can reach. And so I'd say a foot. Anything below a foot may not be available for some of your like radishes and things like that don't quite get down that deep. But for like sweet corn or things like that, it definitely gets down closer to like 2 feet. So if money's tight or whatever, I just do the first foot, 0 to 12 inches, and go from there. So they make soil probes. I really enjoy soil probes because they're literally just like a tube that's, a quarter in diameter, maybe a 50-cent piece, and you poke a hole in the ground, scoop out the soil in the tube, do that, 10 to 15 times, depending on the size of your garden bed or your garden area. But most gardens aren't going to be more than an acre, so I'd say 12 to 15 samples is very adequate, foot in depth. If you don't have a soil probe, you can always just use a shovel, but you don't want to take all your sample from like one spot. I limit every single location specifically to like half a cup of soil at the most, maybe a 3/4 of a cup, and do that, 9 to 12 times, and then shake it up in a pail, stir it around, and then put in, you only need about a pint of soil for most of these Soi Labs. Put it in a little baggie, about a pint worth, in a pint jar, and that should be adequate. But when you do it with your soil shovel, we're like, well, how do I get a foot depth of soil when you only want me to collect a half a cup of dirt, And so you basically dig a hole that's about a foot deep, by an ice cream pail in diameter. And then what I do is I just take a little narrow strip, or like even put a little, cool-up container in the bottom of it, and just slide, a little ruler. You can just slide a ruler down the side of it, or a stick, so that it catches all the stuff all the way down to the bottom of the hole. And that'd be an easy way to do it. One thing to make it super easy is if you cultivate your soil or rototill it or something like that in the fall, rototill it up. Usually rototill it up to a depth of 6 inches, I'd assume. Once it's rototilled, you just take soil right off the surface and little scoops of it. Then you're only sampling your upper 6 inches, but the 6 inches is the primary rooting area, so you shouldn't have any issues if you fertilize according to that area. But I'd prefer to go to a foot depth. Just kind of increase overall soil health there. So, hopefully that all made sense. It's super easy. Don't take samples too close together. And so then once you get your soil, you're like, well, where do I send it to? Well, you have the NDSU Soil Testing Laboratory. You have Ag-Vice over in North Dakota. I'm not sure what exactly is available in Minnesota, but a lot of your local co-ops sometimes have soil probes for you, to be honest. Where I grew up, you could walk in, like, hey, can I borrow the soil probes? I can take a soil sample. Yep. And then you bring the soil into them, bring them their probe back, and then they send it off to like Ohio, soil testing lab or something like that. They get the results back and they interpret the results for you and give you a recommendation on what to fertilize. Most places will do that. Some places won't give you a recommendation, they just give you the results. If you go directly to the soil lab, they won't necessarily give the results. But what I'd primarily look at soil sampling for would be your nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. Those three are like a must. pH would also be a good one. If your pH is too basic, to like 7.4, 7.5, you might want to look at adding a little bit more sulfur or gypsum to kind of get the soil pH back down to like 7. If your soil pH is closer to 6.6 to 7, I kind of like that range. Phosphorus is most available to plants in that 6.6 to 6.7 pH in that zone. So more nutrients tend to be available for plants, and when it's slightly acidic in nature, like 6.5 to 7 pH. So I prefer that. You could test for soluble salts. How salty is your soil? That could influence and affect how things grow. And you can also test for your organic matter. I like organic matter anywhere from like 3 to 6%. If it's less than 3%, it could be could be improved upon, I guess. And organic matter helps in water infiltration, helps in water retention, and just overall increases the microflora of your garden, your bugs, your insects, your worms, all that kind of stuff. So, and then after that, if you have any more specific issues, you could look into testing for other things like manganese, copper, iron, zinc. I don't know if I'd necessarily recommend it. Oh, maybe sulfur. Sulfur is a very important element or nutrient for like your cucurbits and your brassica species. They're heavy sulfur users. But that's kind of where I'd start testing soil, would be that those types of nutrients and those types of elements. Oftentimes you'll have a sheet that you can turn into these soil labs if you find them online. I know the NDSU one does. And they'll ask you things like, hey, is this for a sample for a lawn or vegetable gardening or flower garden? And then they might ask you, if it's full sun or well drained or poorly drained. And I guess I'll see. I want to send my soil samples in, and I think they're going to send me a recommendation of what to do. So I'm going to be curious to see if that's the same thing that I do or not. But I'll have a follow-up podcast here where I'm going to have the soil results in my hands, and I'm going to go through. Hopefully I have some deficiencies so I can share it with you guys, so I can have a recommendation to share with you. If I don't and it all looks good, I guess I'll kind of let you know, but let you know my numbers and my figures and things like that. Generally, I'm kind of planning on putting a little 1-inch layer of compost on top of my soil to just kind of help it out. You can never go wrong with compost unless you just have too much nitrogen, which can be a problem when you have your tomatoes. If you have too much nitrogen, all they're going to want to do is flower and flower more and flower more, and it'll never really truly ripen its fruit. It'll just kind of keep on putting out new small ones, and it'll never ripen up your tomatoes much. So there is such a thing as too much, and I've been slowly working my nitrogen levels down, but I feel like in the first couple inches of my soil bed, although I do cultivate mine up or shovel it up for that first foot, so I think my first foot might be starting to get a little bit down there, but we'll see. Not the most exciting podcast topic here today, but for those of you guys who had toughed it out with me, thank you for listening. If you enjoy listening to my podcast with all the different types of topics and things like that, I'd encourage you to rate my podcast, leave any comments or reviews. That's super encouraging for me. Kind of helps me continue on doing this. I'm not getting paid for anything. I don't have enough listeners to get advertisements in here and whatnot, but you can even shoot me an email at thehomegrownfam@gmail.com and just kind of give me some constructive criticism. I appreciate that as well. You can also find me on Instagram at @homegrownfam. I'll show pictures of the soil test sheet. I'll show a picture of the soil probe I've been using. I'll show some videos here of my brewing and my cider making here pretty soon on there. I got some pictures of the different types of garlics that I talked about here this last episode. So come check me out on Instagram and enjoy the fall weather out there. It's lovely.